Welcome back to another episode of Killer Bites, the show giving you bite-sized coverage of true crime stories. My name is Brandy, and today I'll be telling you about the disappearance of Brittney Wood. When Brittney Wood was first reported missing, there was only one objective: find Brittney. Had she run away? Had someone taken her? When the horrific circumstances surrounding her case were divulged, what was once just a missing persons case turned into a takedown of an entire family. Her family. Brittney grew up with her mother, her older brother Derek, and a younger brother near Mobile, Alabama. As Chessie Wood's oldest daughter, Brittney and Chessie had a special relationship. Chessie described their relationship as not just mother and daughter, but as being best friends. Brittney also had a great relationship with her father, Wally Hankey, and stepmother, Stephanie Hankey, even though she did not reside with them. Chessie had kids young, and as a single parent to 3, Chessie relied on her own siblings and family friends to help look after her kids. Chessie Woods was one of 5. She had an older brother, Randall, also known as Scott, identical twin sisters, Wendy and Mendy, Sonia, and herself, who all still lived near one another. Chessie was later quoted saying, "If you can't trust your family, who can you trust?" Looking back, they probably would have been safer at the house. Knowing what we know now, I would have to agree with Chessie's later sentiment. But being a young mom and having no reason not to trust those around her, Brittney Nicole Wood was regularly looked after by her aunts and uncles and was so close to her cousins that they felt more like siblings. In 2003, Brittney was just 11 years old. Too scared to tell the police, but knowing she wanted the abuse to stop, she went to an after-school director at a Baptist church and told them that someone had been touching her inappropriately and that it had been going on for over 2 years. The after-school director immediately reported Brittney's claims to the authorities. The identity of the abuser was a 53-year-old man named Ronald Robertson. He was Brittney's maternal grandmother's boyfriend. When Ronald was taken in for questioning, he denied all of the accusations. However, enough evidence was found to charge him. In 2005, Ronald was taken to trial and later convicted. He was sentenced to 25 years to life for the abuse. Brittney was only 12 when she had to testify in court. It's hard to imagine being so young and having to recount the abuse to strangers in the courtroom, but also in front of the person who had abused her. But even as young as she was, and as traumatic as it all played out to be, in reporting and testifying against Ronald, Brittney knew that once he was convicted, she was taking him off the street, and therefore protecting others from potentially falling victim to the same thing. Ronald tried to appeal his sentencing, but it was upheld. In 2023, he is still serving at the Fountain Correctional Facility in Alabama. By high school, Brittney, who was a petite young woman, not much taller than 5 feet tall, was described by her cousins as scrappy and that she would throw down with anybody. But she was not just a spitfire. Those closest to her said she was bright and loving, and she loved children. In 2017, Brittney gave birth to her daughter, Peyton. She was 17 years old, and in what her mother, Chessie, described as an abusive relationship. Although the relationship didn't last, Brittney was over the moon about having her daughter. But Brittney was understandably troubled. She was often surrounded by her extended family, and they considered her to be somewhat of a free spirit. She would bounce from one relative's home to another, and she was using and had a gun for personal protection. Others often had to take care for her daughter, Peyton. By 17, Brittney had already experienced a lot of life and a lot of hard situations. And although she had already been through so much, our story is unfortunately just beginning. At the beginning of 2012, Scott Woods, Brittney's maternal uncle, who had been a National Guardsman, moved back to Alabama. Scott had taken a job at a city steel mill. When Scott arrived back in Alabama, he moved in with his sister, Wendy, and her husband, Donnie Holland. Shortly after moving in, Scott came across disturbing images and messages on the family computer. On February 26, 2012, Scott went to the authorities to report the messages and images that he had seen at his sister and brother-in-law's house. One of the messages that Scott found was from Donald, and it was him complimenting a 12-year-old family member on her capabilities. Once Scott had reported Donald and Wendy Holland, he moved in with his sister Chessie. It's important to note that there are a lot of conflicting stories, opinions, and evidence regarding Scott Woods and his involvement, which we'll get into. But it's also important for the timeline of the story to note that he was the first person to go to the authorities in this case. And because of Scott's reporting, an investigation was launched regarding child abuse and SA in the Holland household. On May 27th, private Facebook messages sent between Brittany and one of her female relatives show that the relative informed Brittany about her own SA at the hands of 3 of their male relatives. On May 30th of 2012, around 7:30 p.m., Brittany packed a small tote bag with clothes and toiletries. She told her mom, Chessie, that she was going to her friend Courtney's house and sleeping over. Once Brittany had walked past the end of the driveway and was out of sight from her mother, she got in a car with her uncle Donnie instead of heading to Courtney's. Donnie was married to Chessie's sister, Wendy. Chessie had known Donnie since she was 10. Chessie, as well as other friends and family, described Donnie as being an incredibly charismatic, friendly, happy, and outgoing person. He was the kind of guy who made friends anywhere he went. Chessie said he rode the roads all the time, going here and there. We thought he was enjoying life to its fullest. Donnie was a construction contractor in Fish River, which is in Baldwin County in Alabama. Him and his wife, Wendy, had 2 acres of land and a nice-sized home where they were known to host parties and barbecues. He was always making sure everyone was having a good time. He regularly was in charge of organizing family outings. According to relatives, Donnie had a special bond with his young niece, Brittany. He would describe Brittany as being more like a sister to him. Looking back on it now, some of the family members believe that Brittany had met up with Donnie to confront him about the Facebook messages she had received from her relatives about the SA. Donnie Holland was the last person to see Brittney Wood. He had been staying with a friend in Styx River, which was about 45 minutes away from where he had originally picked Brittany up at her mom's house. Cell phone records gathered later by detectives placed Brittany at this property. This was the last trace of Brittany. On June 1st, 2012, just one day later, Uncle Donnie was found in his car with what appeared to be a severe self-inflicted gunshot wound to his car was parked in a very secluded area overlooking Fish River in South Baldwin. Wendy Holland and Jennifer Gonzalez Moore, the friend that Donnie had been staying with, were the ones to discover Donnie in his parked car. His car was still running, and although he had been badly wounded, he was still alive. Before calling 911, Wendy erased 4 text messages from Donnie's phone. Jennifer contacted a detective named Eric Winberg to report Donnie had attempted to end his life. When Eric had arrived at Fish River, the paramedics were taking Donnie out of his car and into an ambulance. As he approached the scene, he heard Wendy repeatedly ask Donnie, "Where's Brittany?" It's worth mentioning that Eric Winberg was the detective that had been investigating Donnie regarding the claims that had been made by Scott Wood. Just days before, Donnie had been given a polygraph test by the sheriff's office. He did not pass. On the day that Donnie shot himself, Eric was supposed to meet with him to discuss the investigation. Eric believes Donnie knew he was going to be arrested. Donnie was taken to the hospital. He was not conscious, but he was miraculously still alive. Family began to gather. At this time, all that the family knew was that Uncle Donnie had tried to end his life. Besides Wendy Holland, no one had any idea that Brittany had been with him. Her mother still believed that she had gone to her friend Courtney's house. While Donnie was hooked up to the heart monitor, Wendy and Chessie's sister, Sonia, heard Wendy ask Donnie, "Where's Brittany?" Every time Wendy said Brittany, Sonia noticed a change in Donnie's vitals and brain activity. But Donnie was never able to tell anyone exactly what had happened. He passed away shortly after being taken to the hospital. It was only when no one could reach Brittany to tell her about her uncle shooting himself that the family realized something wasn't right. Chessie called Courtney, the friend she thought her daughter had been staying with. Courtney not only didn't know where Brittany was, but said that they had not had any plans to meet up. It wasn't until the day after Donnie had shot himself that Brittney was reported missing. Friends of Brittney said that she had told them she was going to go visit her uncle Donnie Holland at a place out by the Styx River Basin, about 40 miles away from her home in Tillman's Corner. The cell phone records showed that her last activity was on May 30th. And this is when everything really begins to unravel. Because Brittney's phone records showed that the last place she had used it was at the property her uncle was staying at, investigators searched that area. Inside the home, they found Brittney's tote bag and other personal belongings that she had packed, but there were no signs of foul play. Her phone records showed that on May 30th, she had multiple outgoing calls between multiple people, but one person in particular was Brittney's friend, Bradley, who she called and texted with multiple times that night. When Bradley was asked what he had talked about with Brittney, he claimed he wasn't able to remember. There wasn't any reason to believe he had anything to do with her disappearance or the investigation going on with Donnie, but it's hard not to be a little suspicious. Not a lot of time had passed between when Brittney was reported missing and when he was asked about what they had talked about, and he couldn't remember? He then changed his phone, which was also strange. Bradley was never a suspect and was never able to give any answers in what was such a crucial time in the search for Brittney. Unfortunately, he is now deceased. Before anyone considered Donnie having anything to do with Brittney's disappearance, people wondered if Brittney had just run away. But no one could imagine Brittney taking off and leaving her daughter Peyton behind. And because of how close Brittney was with her mom, it was also hard to believe Brittney would take off without her too. Presumably, if she was going somewhere, she would have taken them with her. When Chessie called to report her daughter missing, what she thought would happen was law enforcement would call in the troops to begin their search. But she quickly felt law enforcement wasn't reacting in as big of a way as she was expecting them to, and that they weren't giving her the support she needed. So she called in her own troops and along with her family began searching for Brittney. What we can't forget is that there was an investigation into Donnie Holland that had begun prior to Brittney's disappearance. With it now being known that Brittney had been with her uncle, new questions arose. If Brittney had met up with him to confront him about the message she received from her family member over Facebook, there was a possibility that Donnie didn't die from a self-inflicted gunshot, but actually had Brittney shot him and run off? The gun at the scene where Donnie attempted to end his life belonged to Brittney Wood. This began to raise suspicion that he was shot by somebody else, or had he done something to her and then he decided to turn the gun on himself. The discovery of Brittney Wood's gun also led some to believe it may have been planted. According to his wife, Wendy, Donnie was threatening the night before that he was going to take his own life. And that's why her and Jennifer Moore went out looking for him the next day. Nikki Patterson, the assistant district attorney in Mobile County, told Alabama Local News in March 2019, Baldwin County had every reason in the world to think of it as a suicide. At that time, there was no indication of the depth of what we were looking at, and no one was aware that Brittney was missing. Because Donnie's death was so quickly ruled as self-inflicted, a ballistic analysis was never carried out, meaning the DNA on the gun and bullet was never recovered. By June 15th, Chessie and her family, along with different organizations that had volunteered to help, were still out searching all along Styx River with no new leads. The search for Brittney continued, but so did the investigation into the allegations against Donnie Wood. 2 weeks before Brittney's disappearance, Donnie and Wendy's children were interviewed separately. Their youngest daughter had admitted that her parents had been abusing her. When the eldest daughter was interviewed and asked if she believed her younger sister, she said that she did think it was true. When she was asked why she thought it was true, she said, "Because I've also been abused." Was this the reason why Donnie had not been staying at the family home? After Donnie's death, more and more information came to light, and other family members were implicated. The first were Wendy's twin sister, Mendy, and her husband, Dustin Kent. Allegedly, Donnie was the leader in this circle, and he would decide which adult could spend time with a certain child, how long they could spend together, and when the encounter would take place. Soon, the attention was less focused on the disappearance of Brittney and almost entirely focused on the SA. The abused turned into the abusers, making the circle generational. On June 19th, Dustin Kent and Scott Wood were arrested. By the end of July of 2012, 11 people had been arrested for their involvement in the sexual abuse of the children. As well as Scott and Dustin, Dustin's wife, Mendy Kent, family friends Nelton Butch Morgan, James Kumba, Jennifer Moore, Donnie's son, Donnie Jr., and Derek Wood, Brittany's older brother, were all accused of being involved. Family friends Jennifer Moore and William Brownlee and Wendy Holland. Even Chessie was arrested. One of Donnie and Wendy's daughters alleged that Chessie had been intimately involved with Donnie and herself. However, Sonia Wood said that when she spoke to her niece, the young girl denied Chessie's involvement. Some have said that Chessie was really arrested because of how vocal she had been to the news outlets about her disdain for the law enforcement and their lack of help to find her daughter. She not only was upset with their search efforts, but she couldn't understand why when Donnie had been taken to the hospital, his hands were covered to protect any evidence. But officers were so quick to rule it as a suicide that they removed the hand covers without the ballistic analysis. Not performing that could have potentially led Chessie closer to an answer regarding her daughter's disappearance. She continued to claim her innocence, which a lot of people had a hard time believing since the abuse was going on with so many people in her family. How could she be completely unaware? Maintaining her innocence, she was ultimately only charged with a misdemeanor of child endangerment. Although Scott was the one to initially start the investigation into his brother-in-law, his motivations for making that report are debatable. In an interview, Chessie said that her brother Scott had been staying with Wendy and her family when he discovered the message on the computer. Once Scott had reported his findings, he asked Chessie if he could stay with her. Scott Wood would not hurt a child, she said. Yet, Nikki Patterson, the assistant district attorney, would contend that Scott was in fact in love with one of the girls who was being abused and only began talking to law enforcement officers about what was going on out of jealousy. The theory was that once he found out that his brother-in-law was also involved with the girl, Scott wanted to get rid of him so that he could have her to himself. Chessie called the prosecutor's theory ridiculous. She believes Scott would have known that if he reported the abuse, the girl would have been taken out of the home. Chessie said none of it made sense. They could not give me a good answer of why Scott would tell on himself. Eric Winberg believed that once Scott reported Donnie Holland, he was asked to take the victim out of the home to stay with a different family member. The victim later told Eric that on their way to the house of the family member, Scott stopped at the hotel he was staying at to get his uniform for his night shift. Due to the victim's statements, the detectives believed that she had been taken to the hotel for the purposes of being intimate. They investigated the hotel, and the bedding and overall description of the room were consistent with her statement. When Scott was interviewed by Detective Eric Winberg, while Eric was questioning him, he gave nonverbal yeses. He never gave a full confession, but Eric said that they knew what he had done based on what the victim had stated. Chessie had said that there was not only zero evidence of abuse, but that it was clear to her that the victim believed that Scott was the reason her parents were no longer with her. And the reason wasn't because of what her parents had done, but because of what Scott had done by reporting them. And that was the reason she named him. It was determined by the authorities that the sex abuse allegations were not connected to Brittany's disappearance, but they also admitted that a lot of vital information disappeared along with Brittany. Chessie has never given up searching for her daughter. With each year that passed by, she was less and less hopeful that she would find Brittany alive. But she believes her sister Wendy does know what happened. In 2021, Chessie was part of a documentary surrounding her daughter's disappearance and the takedown of her family. She said, "I promised her that I would not give up ever until I take my last breath. And if this documentary is it, which we're praying it may be, we were willing to give it a shot." Baldwin County Sheriff Huey Haas Mack said, "Closure will only come when Miss Wood's killer or killers are indicted and Miss Wood's body is located. As far as the Woods family and the family friends that were arrested for child abuse and SA, each one was convicted and sentenced differently. The assistant district attorney, Nikki Patterson, said prosecutors were willing to offer some of those involved in the case plea agreements to spare the children from having to testify. Dustin Kent eventually admitted to repeatedly lying to the investigators when he had first denied witnessing a involving the twin sisters and one of the victims. During his preliminary hearing, Sergeant Scott Congleton of the Mobile Police Department testified that there was abuse at the hands of Dustin Kent that had occurred in 2008. The victim was his niece, and she was just 13 years old at the time the abuse took place. She did not come forward until the death of her father. Dustin agreed to cooperate with law enforcement so that he could get a lesser sentence. He was tried in both Baldwin County and Mobile and was sentenced to 17 years in prison after pleading guilty to second-degree rape in Baldwin County. He pleaded out in Mobile County as well and received the same sentence in November 2015. The assistant district attorney, Nikki Patterson, recommended he be allowed to serve his sentences concurrently. Because of his cooperation and help, more people who had committed the same crimes were convicted. She said, "Is it enough? Probably not. But on the other hand, I think it would be unfortunate if only 1 or 2 people were convicted when we knew how many people were ultimately involved in these cases." Dustin apologized to the victims and said he hoped they could live a normal life. When Scott Randall Wood was first interviewed by Eric Winberg, Eric asked him if he had been involved with the victim, because she had said that. Eric said that while Scott said no, he nodded his head yes. Eric took that as a tacit admission that it probably had occurred. Chessie believes that Scott was wrongfully accused. She said that her brother had often nodded his head when listening to someone speak so that they knew he was listening, not that he was agreeing. Chessie had also said that her brother grew up with 4 sisters and was their protector. When Scott had his daughter, he was the sole caregiver. To Chessie, Scott's involvement in this case was exposing the people who were harming children. She thinks that the excuse that the detective gave her of Scott finding himself with an opportunity to get the girl away from her parents so he could have her to himself was a bit of a stretch. And to Chessie's point, if Donnie and Wendy Holland had no problem wanting their children participating in this, it does feel like a bit of a reach that Scott would think that removing Donnie and Wendy from the situation would guarantee himself to be the one who would be with her. Once Scott was arrested, he was the first family member that started cooperating with law enforcement, allowing authorities to cast a wider net. During his trial, he pleaded guilty to and in February 2015, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. His reasoning for ultimately pleading guilty to second-degree was in exchange for dropping some of the other charges against him. Derek and Donald Holland Jr. were granted youthful offender status, meaning their records are sealed. However, Derek spoke about his charges in a documentary about the case. He testified that he had with Wendy Holland when he was a teenager. He said that he was a victim starting around 6 or 7 years old. It was only when he was older that Derek was coerced by Donnie into participating in the abuse. Derek faced up to 20 years in prison for each of his convictions, but ultimately took a plea deal and served 3 years in prison. He has also had to register as a sex offender for life. Donald Holland Jr.'s first hearing took place behind closed doors. He was not sentenced right away. Baldwin County Assistant District Attorney Teresa Hines said the sentence would depend on his cooperation in the future. Because his records were sealed, it's unclear how much time Donald Holland Jr. served. Brittney Wood Kent, the wife of Dustin Kent and Wendy's identical twin sister, was sentenced to 40 years in prison. This was the maximum amount possible for her crimes. During his trial, family friend William Brownlee claimed in court that he was forced to commit the acts he was accused of. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum time allowed. The judge in his case said he deserved more, calling his actions depraved, disgusting, and sickening to this court. Family friend Nelton Lloyd Morgan was sentenced to 10 years in prison and 5 years probation under a split sentence issued by Judge Joseph Norton during a hearing at the Baldwin County Courthouse in Bay Minette. Under terms of the sentencing guidelines, Nelton will serve his probation term once he's released from the Baldwin County Correction Center. The balance of his sentence is suspended, meaning that if Morgan serves out the terms of his probation, the remainder of his sentence is dismissed. He reached a similar deal for the charges against him in Mobile County. Nelton Morgan has been required to register as a sex offender and agreed to testify against other defendants as part of his plea agreement. During Wendy Holland's trial, one of the family members testifying against Wendy accused her of being part of the family ring. A minor at the time of the trial, so she will not be named, told jurors that she was first molested while still in. She said her earliest memories included encounters with her adult relatives, one of whom was the defendant, Wendy Wood Holland. "We would be in a circle and we'd all switch up," the girl testified. Prosecutor Teresa Hines asked how often such things occurred. "It happened a bunch," she said. Dustin Kent, who later pleaded guilty, testified that he participated in a 6-way encounter that included Wendy Holland, the young victim, and his wife Mendy Kent, Wendy Holland's twin sister. The young girl said through tears that even through all of this, she still loves Wendy with all my heart. When Mitzi Johnson Theodoro, the defense attorney, gave her opening statements, she compared the victim to the George Costanza character in the old Seinfeld comedy series, saying that she, like he, told lies that became more and more outrageous. Just saying something doesn't make it true. Just believing something doesn't make it true. The defense lawyer then brought up statements in which the victim had initially denied Wendy had done anything to her. She said the girl had falsely accused a total of 8 people of advances, including the lead police investigator. The victim responded by saying people might have misunderstood her. She admitted making up 2 names of 2 people and accusing them of sexual abuse because a relative was pressuring her for information. She continued by saying she was truthful about her allegations against Wendy and other close relatives. "I wouldn't lie to anyone about this," she said. When the prosecutor responded, she told the jury that the victim had had a hard time recalling specific instances because it happened so often. She said this was her norm. This is what happened to her on a regular basis. When one of Wendy's daughters said, "The only time my mother touched me was to lead me to the monster in the shadows." One of Wendy's daughters asked to have a letter that she'd written read out loud to the court. In the letter, the victim said that the years of abuse left her traumatized. She has a hard time trusting anyone, gets angry easily, and rarely feels safe. "I was a little girl being held down. The people who were supposed to protect me were the ones hurting me." Prosecutors told jurors during the closing arguments that Wendy Holland, her late husband, and others were monsters who subjected their own children and others to perversions that were almost too depraved to understand. Jurors took 2 hours to convict Wendy Wood Holland. The judge sentenced the Alabama woman to 219 years in prison. She showed no emotion when the verdict was read. And that is the story of the disappearance of Brittney Wood and the takedown of her family and the crimes they committed. As we know, Brittney's case is still unsolved, which is terrible in and of itself, but no one could have predicted the darkness that came to light once the search for Brittney began. In fact, this case is believed to be the largest case ever prosecuted in Alabama. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Donnie Holland is responsible for Brittney's disappearance? Does Wendy Holland have the answers and is just not telling? Could all of the Woods/Hollands have been involved, or is it possible that not everyone knew what was happening behind closed doors? No matter the answers, this is an incredibly sad case. Even when there's seemingly justice, in situations like these with such young children involved, it's hard to say if any of the people responsible were given significant punishment. That's all I have for you today. I'm Brandy. Thanks for watching Killer Bites.